Hi, and welcome back. We're on the second module of the course, which is the Trustworthy Cloud Provider. And so Tim is going to be taking us through this content.
All right, thanks, Mark. My name is Tim Rains. I'm the Chief Security Advisor with Microsoft Cybersecurity and Data Protection team. Happy to be here with Mark, who's a cybersecurity architect here at Microsoft. We're going to walk you through some content here, some of the things to think through when you're evaluating cloud service providers. So you want to use a cloud service provider. Maybe you're looking at using it as infrastructure as a service, or you're looking at Office 365 or some sort of workload services. You know, what we want to do in this module is really kind of walk you through some of the things to think about when you're selecting cloud service providers, whether it's security, privacy, reliability. Some of the things to think through when you're selecting a cloud service provider. They're going to help answer some of the security and privacy questions that you have. And Mark's going to help me walk through this module. So we've been doing this a long time at Microsoft. I started talking to customers about cloud services probably 4 or 5 years ago. And the initial response wasn't overwhelming. Enterprise customers weren't lining up saying, oh yeah, we'll absolutely move our stuff into somebody else's cloud. The conversations that we had with customers back in those days, they really wanted to understand how the data center was being run, the standards that we were using in our data centers. They had a lot of process questions, and so those were very early days. And you fast forward now, and what you see here on this slide is the cloud is big business. This is a huge business for Microsoft. We've got 20 plus million business customers in our cloud today. So this has come a long, long ways from those early conversations 4, 5, 6 years ago, where there was a lot of questions. So businesses have seen the value of the cloud in driving down IT costs, IT complexity on premise, and they're embracing it in a big, big way. So we've learned a lot from customers on this journey, though. This wasn't, we didn't have all the answers. We still don't have all the answers. We're working with customers all over the world to understand what their requirements are, what the risks are that they see, the security risks, the privacy requirements they have, the compliance requirements they have in their industry and their geographies. So this is very much a partnership. And speaking of partnerships, this is the CIO's favorite slide when we show them this breakdown of roles and responsibilities. Mark, you've used this slide a lot. Why don't you walk us through it?
Sure. I mean, ultimately, this is what it looks like as a partnership between a customer and organization and a trusted cloud provider. And this is assuming that the organization has chosen to trust this cloud provider, which is a huge part of the conversation in this module. And so that breakdown, that top piece is all about the things that the customer, the tenant, ultimately owns. So you own this, you own your data, you own your devices, you own your identities. The bottom piece is all about the stuff that the cloud can take away from you just like that once you get that workload migrated to the cloud, which is that physical problem, the physical host, the network, the data center, the physical security, all of those things of running a data center and all the security associated with having that physicality in your control go away with the cloud. And then, of course, depending on the type of service, SaaS, software as a service, PaaS, platform as a service, or IaaS, infrastructure as a service, the variance of how much you can offload to that cloud provider really varies. And of course, the less responsibility you have, the better, because you have a trusted partner that can handle it. Let them handle it. Go ahead and focus on your business assets and the things that are aligned with your business, your users, your devices, and your data. And that's really what you should be focusing your security resources on, and let the cloud providers take care of that lower level of the stack.
I completely agree. This isn't moving to the cloud isn't necessarily losing responsibility, because CISOs and security professionals and organizations are always responsible for protecting data regardless of where it's at. But what it does do is it delegates a lot of the responsibility over to your cloud service provider, and then enables you to use up more of your time to actually protect data that you have on premise. You have responsibilities, as you can see from the slide, at various different places in the stack. And so the responsibility doesn't go away, but you're actually able to delegate some of the day-to-day operations to your cloud service provider so that you can focus on parts of your your security program that maybe you haven't had time to focus so much on in the past. So the cloud really is a partnership between you and your cloud service provider. So there's a lot of things that we've learned from customers when we started having these conversations early on. A lot of the questions that I would get from customers is, for instance, why should we trust Microsoft? Can you help me with my compliance obligations? Because if you can't help me comply with regulation in my industry or my geography, then we really can't use your cloud. So it's a non-starter unless you're helping me with compliance. And of course, Microsoft has helped customers with compliance on premise for 30 plus years. And so we have a lot of experience in compliance. We have a lot of experience with technology and helping customers in different industries all around the world. A lot of the other questions we had were around security and privacy. What security standards does Microsoft map to? What privacy regulations is Microsoft aware of and Microsoft, paying attention to around the world, because we're a global company and we help other global companies do business all around the world, and we help lots and lots of companies. As I mentioned, 20 million customers in our cloud right now, all around the world. And so privacy is hugely important at Microsoft, and it's actually baked into our products. We have privacy requirements for developers at Microsoft, privacy requirements for operations at Microsoft, and so on. So I'll walk you through some of that here in this presentation today. But we've got lots of questions from customers around the world on security and privacy, compliance, and this is why one of the key tenets when we talk about cloud with our customers is transparency, and we'll get into some of that here. Here's some of the things that you should think through as a security professional or privacy professional out there when you're talking to cloud service providers and you're trying to figure out what cloud services or platforms or infrastructure is right for you and your organization. I think the number one thing that when we first start having conversations with customers about cloud that maybe haven't done a trial yet or haven't tiptoed into it is the one here at the top center of the slide. Know the value of your data and processes and the security and compliance obligations you need to meet. That's really key, because when you run into an organization that says, we can't use the cloud, well, why not? Well, because our data is too sensitive, we can't put it into the cloud. And then you start to have the conversation with them. So you mean all of your data is the same value? There's no data that is more valuable than other data? So the data that everyone has access to is all of equal value? And well, no, actually, we do have data that's different value. Okay, well, so then are you treating your data all the same way as if it's the same value? Because that's a really expensive way to treat all of your data. If you begin to do even some simple data classification, you begin to see that some of the data actually can and should be put into the cloud, because it'll save you a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of administrative effort. And so that's really the core of this whole decision-making process, is for you, the customer, to understand the value of the data that you actually are managing on premise today, and which of those data sets is it appropriate to put into the cloud, and which do you want to keep on premise. That's really important when you start evaluating cloud services, super important. So that's one key thing that I'll point out here on this slide. There are some very other key requirements that you should think about. For instance, I mentioned certifications earlier. So when you go and evaluate cloud service providers, what certifications, attestations, compliance regulations are they actually mapping to? Can they give you audit reports? Can they give you artifacts that you need in order to build that chain of trust and that chain of certification with regulators or whoever you're dealing with in your industry and your geography? Super important to understand that up front. What security standards and privacy standards do they care about within their cloud services? So getting clarity on that stuff is usually pretty important in many different geographies now around the world. Roles and responsibilities around security and compliance, super important. Moving to the cloud, as you saw from the slide that Mark talked about, isn't moving 100% of the responsibility of the cloud service provider. At the end of the day, you are responsible for the compliance of the regulations and standards and so on that you're responsible for. No one can take that responsibility from you. So your cloud service provider can't say, well, now we're responsible for compliance, and so if there's an issue with a certification, you're off the hook because you can just point your regulators to your cloud service provider. That's not the way it works. And so having clear roles and responsibilities with cloud service providers and making sure we all know how this works and we're very clear about it is super important. So getting clarity on that stuff when you're evaluating cloud service providers is super, super important.
Very critical, yeah.
And the last thing I'll point out here is transparency. It's really, it is super important for you to have visibility into how a cloud service provider is doing several things. One of them is development. If you're buying software as a service from a cloud service provider, what development standards are they using to develop that software? Are they paying attention to security and privacy in development? Are they using industry standards like the security development lifecycle? Are they how are they reducing the number of vulnerabilities in their services when they're developing? How are they making those vulnerabilities that will be in those services, because all software is made by humans and humans make mistakes? How are they making the vulnerabilities in those services super, super hard to exploit? What process are they using to develop that software? So you need insight into that. You need to know what they're doing and whether it meets your standards that you're using on premise and hopefully exceeds those standards. The other thing is operations. How are they operating the service? Once the software goes from development into the data center and you're using it, how are they operating it? Can they tell you about their operational security assurance standards? Have they documented those? Will they share them with you? So transparency into how secure development is done, how secure operations is done, how compliance is happening. These things are not really optional. You should be digging into them when you talk to different cloud service providers to find out what they're doing. It's super important.
Yeah, I mean, how can you trust something if you don't know what it is? I mean, that's a key piece.
Now, as we talk to customers about cloud, a lot of them have concerns, right? They're trying to understand how the cloud is being operated, how the services in the cloud are being developed, and so on. And so what we did is we actually went, and I've talked to customers all over the world, but we did a formal study with Comscore back in 2014 to try to find out what the top concerns are around moving into the cloud. And so here you can see 400 respondents in the US to the survey that we did with Comscore. More than 70% of these enterprise customers in the survey cited these concerns that they had about cloud security. And so you can see, for instance, 63% of them were concerned about malware. 61% said that they were concerned about a system outage due to a security incident. 61% said that they were concerned about theft or loss of customer data. All the way down to, for instance, 49%, so just under half, said they were concerned about government surveillance. So these things are top of mind, we know, for enterprise customers in the United States. And we pay very, very close attention to this with the transparency that I'm talking about, so that we know that these are their concerns. We're going to release information and publish information and have conversations with them about these concerns and what we're doing to help them manage the risk around these concerns. Now, it's just not about the United States. Obviously, cloud is global. So we also did the same type of study in places where we know privacy is top of mind for so many people. And so Germany, France, Spain, again, we looked at over 1,000 enterprise customers responded to our survey there with Comscore back in 2014. Very, very similar list of concerns. Again, malware, system outages, theft or loss of customer data, super important. Again, lack of transparency into how data is being managed. Government surveillance comes up again. So we know what the top concerns are. And I can tell you from my personal conversations with thousands of customers around the world over the last 5-6 years about this topic, that we're very, very plugged into our enterprise customers, what their concerns are about cloud and moving data from on-premise into the cloud. And we have to be transparent. We have to share with them what we're doing to mitigate the risks that they see to their data, not only on-premise, because we've helped them with on-premise IT for 30 plus years, but now hybrid. So we're going to have stuff on-premise, we're going to have stuff in the cloud, and then for some of the customers I talked to, they're 100% in the cloud. And so in all three of those scenarios, we have to have enough information and share enough information about development of cloud services, operation of cloud services, compliance. We have to give them enough information so that they know that we're treating their data with the respect it deserves. We've got their back when it comes to security, and we're going to help them mitigate the risks that are the highest priority to their organizations. So when we take a look at some of the perceptions that the customers said that they had versus the reality, we had two groups of customers that we talked to here. So we talked to a group of customers that have not adopted the cloud at that point, and then we talked to customers that had adopted the cloud, and we wanted to look at how their perceptions change or how their perceptions are different between the group that hadn't adopted and the group that did adopt. And it's very interesting. See, on the left here you can see 60% were concerned about data security, 45% were worried that using the cloud would result in a lack of control over their data, and then 42% doubted the reliability of the cloud. And I can tell you 5 years ago, when we had this conversation with customers, this was very similar to the concerns that many customers talked to me directly about, right? So, and again, transparency and releasing information and sharing information and having conversations about how the cloud is being operated, how the software is actually being developed, goes a long ways to answering these questions. Now, the group of customers that moved into the cloud and actually adopted the cloud, their perception about the value of the cloud was much, much different. And so you can see that here on the right-hand side. 94% said they gained security benefits that they didn't have with on-premise technology. So in this case, 94% of those in that group said, listen, we used to do it on-premise. We used to have those concerns about security. But when we actually moved into the cloud, we actually saw that the security was better in the cloud than what we were actually able to manage on-premise, which is huge for them. Now they don't have to spend all that time and effort on premise. They've moved a lot of that responsibility to their cloud service provider, and they actually perceive now that they're getting better security than they had on premise. And as I mentioned before, the stuff that they're continuing to do on premise, because most of these environments are hybrid, the security professionals working on premise now have more time, more resources, more budget typically to focus on premise security in a way that they couldn't before because they were spread so thin. Again, going back to the findings, 62% have seen an increase in levels of privacy protection, and 75% have experienced improved service availability. So we've seen this, we've done this study a couple different times over time, and it always comes out sort of the same. Before you take the plunge, you're really worried about security and privacy, compliance, you're worried about the reliability of the cloud, and then after you take the plunge, then you can compare what your experience is using the cloud to what you were doing on premise, and you can see the numbers are dramatically different. They're very happy with the cloud versus what was going on premise.
And we've seen the same thing in the implementation piece. Whenever we work with a customer that's looking at the cloud and hasn't experienced it, hasn't worked with it, they have a very specific set of concerns, much like what you had on the left on the slide. And then after we work with them, and or if they've been working on the cloud and they brought us in because they want us to help with a specific cloud project or enhancing it or adding workloads to it, they have a very different perspective on the cloud, and they're really looking at how do I utilize it, how do I bring all this extra security, and a lot of those initial security concerns or those perceptions are so different after an organization has worked with the cloud for a while, and a lot of them just simply love the uptime, they love the reliability, and it's stuff that they, in many cases, struggled to get on premises, and not in all cases, but in many cases.
So the sort of the four pillars that many customers talk to us about over time that we know are top of mind for so many customers around the world is security, privacy, compliance, and transparency. And arguably transparency is the most important because by, again, having these conversations, releasing information, sharing information with customers on how we do security, privacy, and compliance is completely key here. It is unreasonable for us to believe that customers would just go into the cloud and trust us without sharing information that shows them that we're at least meeting their internal IT standards and exceeding those IT standards in most cases, that we're meeting the privacy expectations and requirements that they have regardless of where they are in the world, and that we're actually able to help them meet their compliance obligations, because if they don't continue to meet their compliance obligations, then they're not going to be in business very long. So it's key for us to be able to help them prove that they're meeting their compliance obligations, that we're meeting privacy expectations in different markets around the world and regulations, and of course that we're keeping the data secure, whether it's in their on-premise environment or up in the cloud or being transmitted between the two. We have to make sure that we're sharing how we're doing all of this stuff so that they can actually see what's going on, and yes, this does meet or exceed our own standards. So that's super, super important in most of the conversations I have with customers around the world. Now, when it comes to compliance, we have a huge compliance program here at Microsoft, and you can see from this slide, this is a snapshot, and it's getting kind of dated at this point. You can see the date in the top right-hand corner. This was a snapshot across some of our major cloud services, and keep in mind we have hundreds of cloud services at Microsoft now. But it shows you some of the certification, attestation, compliance status of a few of these. This changes over time, which is why it has a date on the right-hand side. So by the time you see this video, the yeses and nos on this slide across these different services and across these different certifications and attestations and standards has absolutely changed. So you should keep up to date on this, and I'll share a little bit later where you can get the latest and greatest information. But you can see that most of the customers that I talk to, they're very concerned about compliance because it's not optional. It's actually it's regulated and they have to do it. So we usually start talking about ISO 27001 because that's the international standard for information security programs. You want to make sure that you have one documented. You want to have an auditor come in and make sure that yes, indeed, you do have it documented. Super important, and many cloud service providers have that certification today. But when you start layering on some of these other certifications that you see here, like SOC 1 Type 2 and SOC 2 Type 2, those certs are very, very challenging to get and to maintain. Most of the customers I talk to that have compliance experts in the room, once they start to see that we're getting a SOC 1 Type 2 that takes months and months of audit activity, and then you layer on top of that some of these other things like FedRAMP and the EU model clauses, CJIS, which is for the criminal justice system, trusts the cloud enough to put their criminal justice system data into the cloud. When you start to see all of these different attestations and certifications accredited to these different services, it builds a lot of trust because the customers see what they're doing on premise and how they've been struggling to get some of these certifications and keep them over time, the amount of money and effort it takes for them to do that. By moving into the cloud, they transfer some of that effort and some of that resource requirement to their cloud service provider, which then helps them meet their certification attestation requirements. So again, it starts to shift some of the effort into the cloud service provider, and that makes it easier for them to do what they're doing on premise. So this, for a lot of customers that have compliance obligations, this is a big deal for them. When they see the number of attestations and certifications that we have, this helps them move forward with the cloud right away because we're helping them meet one of the things that's not optional for them, which is regulation. So this is another example I just pulled out, ISO 27018. So this is an international standard for privacy, specifically cloud privacy. A lot of the CISOs and security professionals I talk to around the world have a list of privacy questions that they've been creating over time that they'll ask cloud providers or ISVs about whether they do these privacy things. And when they learn there's an actual international standard now, because this is a relatively new standard, that can actually inform that list of questions, they can actually just go to those cloud providers or to those ISVs and say, hey, do you do ISO 27018? Do you have this certification? It makes the questions a lot easier to manage, right? They don't have to have their own privately, created list of questions. They don't have to use third-party list of questions. There's actually a standard. And so, Microsoft was the first cloud service provider to get this standard for our cloud services, which is, we feel really good about. One of the reasons why we're able to get it so quickly is because we have such a rigorous privacy program for our on-premise software. So for all of the software that we've been developing, we've had privacy principles for developers at Microsoft for many, many years. And so privacy is baked into our development process. Privacy is top of mind for us with our products. So it makes it much easier for us to meet privacy requirements in the cloud because we've already been doing it with all of our other product lines for many, many years. So if you're a CISO or a security professional and you've got your own homegrown list of privacy questions that you ask ISVs and cloud providers, go check it out, because you might have a better list here with ISO 27018, and it'll make these conversations about privacy a lot more concise and a lot shorter just by using the international standard that's already out there. Here's another great resource that a lot of the customers that I talk to in the 28 EU countries that are out there, European Union countries that are out there, that have data protection authorities in their countries. So if you're trying to do something in the EU, you have to meet the EU model clauses. And so they have very strict privacy rules there. They have very strict regulation around data, how data can be transmitted, and so on. And so what happened is this Article 29 Data Protection Working Party sent Microsoft this letter that I'm showing you here on the slide that essentially allows you, if you're doing business in the EU, instead of having to go to all 28 EU countries and negotiate and prove that you're actually using, you're protecting data in a way that's in accordance with the rules and regulation and laws there, you can take this letter, and this letter is a shortcut that allows you to go to the different data protection authorities in the EU and say, hey, we have this letter. We're using Microsoft's cloud. The Article 29 Data Protection Working Party says that Microsoft is doing it, in a way that is very much aligned with EU privacy principles and so on. And this will help you get through that gauntlet of talking to all of those different data protection authorities. This letter, as you can see here, the working party, in practice, this will reduce the number of national authorizations required to allow the international transfer of data. So for a lot of customers that operate and do business in the EU, this becomes a very powerful tool for them that will save them a lot of time and a lot of work, potentially. Another one of the concerns that I hear from customers all over the world is government access to data. So there's been a couple of things that have been confused in this whole topic over the years. There's kind of two things going on here. One of them is that governments have always had the ability to come with a subpoena or a warrant or some sort of legal tool to get access to information that companies, organizations hold. They've always had the ability to do this. And so if law enforcement comes to your organization with a subpoena or a warrant, your lawyers are going to look at it and determine whether or not they're going to cooperate with that. So at Microsoft, we take that very, very seriously. If law enforcement comes to us and asks us for access to specific data that they want to use in an investigation and so on, our preference is 100% of the time to redirect law enforcement back to the organization, back to the customer that they're asking about. 100% of the time, that's what we're going to try to do. We have a lot of lawyers at Microsoft that will go over those orders, make sure they're completely valid. And I'm going to show you some data on how often this stuff actually happens to give you an idea of what the probability is. So if you're trying to figure out whether this is a real risk to your organization or not, we publish data every 6 months that shows you the volume of these requests and the nature of these requests, which will give you some idea of what the probability and impact of these requests would be. Because remember, risk is made up of probability and impact. So we release the information on law enforcement requests so that you can understand what the probability and impact, what the risk is of this type of government access to data request.
Yeah, and one thing I just want to emphasize there is what you said is it's your data. It's not Microsoft's data. So if the law enforcement comes to us saying, hey, we need a copy of data on XYZ user that happens to be part of your corporate tenant or whatever the case may be, you know what? That's not for Microsoft to step in. That is something that we absolutely want law enforcement to talk to you to get the access from. It is not our data. It is your data. And so that's really the philosophy that we take there.
The thing that has been confused here is, so we have this government access to data using subpoenas and warrants and so on. That's always been there for virtually every organization around the world that works or exists in a country. The government of that country can come to them using legal means and ask them for information. The thing that's been confused in this issue is government surveillance, where governments have surveillance programs for different things, for instance, military espionage. And of course, they've always had these programs in place. And so these two things have been confused. Now, no one knows what their capabilities are when it comes to government surveillance because they're secret. They're not out there telling people what their capabilities are. And so we don't know what their capabilities are. We read the same news articles that you read about what the government is doing and trying to get access to data, that they're trying to get data off the cables, underneath the ocean and so on. Okay, so we don't know what their capabilities are. So what I'm going to do later in this presentation is walk you through some of the ways that we're trying to protect your data from that type of surveillance. Because we actually think that the governments should actually come through the front door in the light of day with the subpoenas, with the warrants, and get the data that way so that you can see them coming. We will redirect them to you, or they'll come directly to you and you'll see this. And so it's all above board. And that's why Brad Smith has been a tireless advocate for reforming government surveillance. And so he did a series of blogs on this topic, and we'll share the URL later in the presentation where you can go and read a lot of the things that he's written and a lot of the principles that Microsoft follows when it comes to government access to data. So super important topic. Now, I mentioned transparency and why that's so important. So as I mentioned, government data requests, we publish a report every 6 months, and I'll show you what that looks like here on this website. So you can see the URL in the browser. But we've been publishing this report now, at the time of the recording of this, you can see all the different 6-month periods that we've been doing. So we've been publishing this report since 2012, every 6 months, and you can just go and download one of the reports. It's also available in Excel format so that you can crunch numbers if that's what you want to do. But as you go down here, you can see that different countries have different volumes of law enforcement requests. And so what we're trying to do is be very transparent about the volume of requests from different countries around the world, because we know that this is a risk that some of the customers are concerned about. And so if we give you enough information on the volume of those requests and what those requests really are, that will give you enough information to figure out what the probability impact is if it happens. So what I'm showing you here is the total number of requests, the accounts, so the number of accounts that were requested, and then what's actually being requested. So you can see there's a lot of concern about contents of email or files or pictures being disclosed. But really what's being disclosed here, you can see in this report, in this time period, 73.18% of the time is actually subscriber and transactional data. So 75% of the time, they're not asking about, the warrant and the subpoena is not asking for specific content. They're asking for transactional subscriber data. So let me show you what that actually is. If you just go up here and we click on this Principles, Policies, Practices FAQ, this actually answers a lot of these questions. So what are content and non-content data? If we click on this, you'll actually see when it comes to those 75% of the requests that I mentioned earlier, this is what subscriber data looks like. This is what the subpoena or the warrant is actually asking specifically for. So there's never a time when someone gets unfettered access to data in the cloud. That's not the way that these legal instruments work. They have to come with a valid warrant and ask for specific information. And if we go back to the data, you'll see that there's times when the data that they're asking for, the information doesn't even exist. So you can see here there's a percentage of time that no data was found. So 16% of the time in this time period that we're looking at here, the data they asked for didn't even exist. And so you should use this as a resource. If you're trying to figure out whether government access to data is a real risk for your organization, and there's many organizations that I talk to around the world that really aren't that concerned about this because they already get warrants and subpoenas from law enforcement in their region. They already understand what the impact is, what the probability is, and this isn't news to them. But they do want to know if someone's coming to us and asking for their data in our cloud, and that's why we redirect them to law enforcement, to the customer 100% of the time if we can. And it's our preference that the customer deal with law enforcement directly. And then if law enforcement will not redirect a request, we always ask for the ability to actually at least notify the customer that it's happening, because that's the risk that they're really concerned about, is that the government asks for data and they weren't notified about it. So we'll always try to redirect, we'll always try to notify, and this data will help you understand the volume and the types of requests that we get, and this will help you understand what the real risk is. So many of the customers I talk to around the world use this data to help them understand the risk, and for most of them, the risk turns out to be really, really remote. The impact turns out to be not as big as they read about in the newspaper, and that risk actually becomes lower priority than some of the other risks that they're managing on premise, like malware, service outages, fires in the data center, all of this stuff that they've been managing for all these years. Once they get enough information, once there's enough transparency,
they can actually quantify the risk and measure it against everything else.
Exactly, and they stack rank it with all of the other risks that they're already managing, and they realize that it's a pretty low risk for most of them, not everybody, but most of them, and they can move on and manage other risks if that's what they want to do. At least they have the information that they need in order to understand the risk and decide how they want to manage that.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So other things we do around transparency, I mentioned understanding how apps are being developed in the cloud and how they're being operated, super important. At Microsoft, we have a thing called the Security Development Lifecycle, SDL. We have another thing called Operational Security Assurance, OSA. We've published numerous white papers on both of these. We give the SDL away for free. Many organizations around the world have adopted the SDL to do secure development. Really, the goals of the SDL are to drive down the number of vulnerabilities and to drive down the severity of vulnerabilities in software, and then to make it super, super hard for any vulnerabilities in the product to actually get exploited. And so we've shared the SDL with the industry for many years. Organizations like Cisco and Adobe have adopted the SDL. Other organizations in the oil and gas industry, healthcare industry, governments have adopted the SDL as a way to do the same thing with their own on-premise software. And so now now that Microsoft is doing cloud services, we've been using the SDL to do all of these enterprise cloud services like Office 365, Azure, and so on. The SDL is a very key part of how those services are being developed. Operational security assurance will show you how we're actually operating, the security requirements we have for operations staff in our data center, so that once a particular feature functionality becomes operational, moves from development into the data center. That's not where security ends. That's where security starts again. We have operational security assurance that shows people how we're operating our services. I talked about government data requests, transparency centers. So I've been at Microsoft many years. There's always somebody saying, hey, there's backdoors in software services. And so what we do is we actually have transparency centers opened up in different places around the world where governments can come and do code reviews of Microsoft products. They can actually look for those backdoors. They can look for vulnerabilities. They can do all of that stuff in a Microsoft Center and assure themselves that there's no backdoors and there's no obvious vulnerabilities in the software and that we're doing what we're saying that we're doing. Now, you as an enterprise customer, an IT professional, security professional, the benefit that you get from that is by proxy, someone in a government that you trust is looking at this and assuring themselves that it's worthy of operating, in the military, financial services, all the critical infrastructure of the countries. Our software is actually secure enough to operate critical infrastructure. And so they're assuring themselves of that, and by proxy, you get that assurance as an enterprise customer. Now, I mentioned surveillance, right? A lot of customers that I talk to want to know how are we protecting data that's being transmitted between their locations and our cloud services, so that whether it's a government doing surveillance or a bad guy just trying to do a man-in-the-middle attack, that their data is secure between our data centers and wherever their information workers happen to be around the world. The other thing they want to make sure is that the data in our data centers is secure, so that if someone ever got into the data center and stole a server or stole a disk drive, that actually getting to the data would still be super difficult to do. And so what I'm going to talk about here briefly is the encryption that we use in order to secure our cloud services. So data in transit between there's 4 scenarios here that I'm going to talk about. Data in transit between you and our data center, data in transit between data centers, and then end-to-end encryption when you're using specific applications. So for instance, I'll use an example like Skype. When you do a video call, I do a lot of travel, so I'll video call my wife I'm overseas, I use Skype, video call her, and we do that video call. At Microsoft, what we want to do is make sure that entire call from my laptop to Microsoft Skype cloud service, from that cloud service to my wife's laptop, that is end-to-end encrypted, so that there's no place in that chain that eavesdropping can happen. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're actually using today what we call best-in-class encryption. So what we're doing is we're moving all of our services towards using 2048-bit key links, which are very long key links, which makes it more time-consuming and more difficult for attackers if they are able to get the data to actually decrypt it, right? So it's all about making it super hard and super time-consuming and super expensive for them to do that type of thing. We're using what's called PFS, Perfect Forward Secrecy, which means that every connection to the server uses a different key. If somehow they're able to get access to one key, that's not going to give them a way to decrypt the entire conversation going on. Mm-hmm. So it makes decrypting encrypted information much, much more difficult. We're also using TLS encryption, so transport layer security encryption versus the old SSL encryption. So we updated a billion Windows systems around the world so that they'll prefer using TLS encryption when they're talking to cloud services or servers in general. And of course, they'll be able to downgrade themselves to SSL if they're talking to a website that doesn't talk TLS. And we give customers the option to turn off SSL on clients altogether, so it'll never use SSL if that's what they want to do. So what we're trying to do is make sure that when they're talking to our cloud services, they're using TLS, they're using 2048-bit keys, and they're using Perfect Forward Secrecy, which makes it much, much harder if governments are doing the type of surveillance that we read about in the newspaper to decrypt these messages. So we're trying to protect our customers' data in transit. Now, in our data centers, remember, these data centers have lots of physical security controls, right? So they've got gates and guards and locks and biometrics and cages and so on. So if someone was able to defeat all of those physical security controls, which is unlikely, got into a data center and somehow got a disk drive or a server out of that data center, it's still not going to give them access to data that's on that drive or on that server, because most of that information is going to be encrypted. And there's lots of different encryption mitigations and controls that customers have the option of using. And it depends on the type of cloud service that they're using, whether it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service. They all have different controls that give customers and developers the option of where, when, and how to protect data using encryption across these types of services. So we're going to get into some of those here. We'll give you a few examples. And then at the end, I'll give you the URL to our blog where we've been blogging about a lot of these controls. We have a cloud security controls series that we've been writing here recently. So we're going to give you more information on how we're doing encryption, both for data in transit and data at rest. I'll give you the URL here in just a few minutes. Now, I mentioned getting information about compliance, getting information about security, getting information about privacy. If you're a Microsoft Cloud customer, you have access to what's called a Trust Center. So each one of our services has a Trust Center. So Azure Trust Center, Office 365 Trust Center, the Dynamics CRM Trust Center. You can go up to that Trust Center, log in with your credentials, and get access to different documents and different information on security, privacy, and transparency, compliance. So those are great resources.
Single place to go.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. So now let's get into some of the security features I mentioned that help customers control access to data, control security around data, protect data, because at the end of the day, once you get through all the certifications, you get through all of the things we do to secure the data, both in development and in operations, they want to know what options they have to mitigate the risks that only they know about. Each organization has a different risk register. Different risks mean different things to different organizations. Yeah, and so that's why they want options.
Yeah, and customers always want to know, how do I control access to my data? How do I encrypt it in a way that only the authorized people can decrypt it? And how do I ensure that that I have control over my data, my privileges, my access? And so there's a number of different features that, as we run through here, Azure Active Directory has a phenomenal set of reporting that really takes some of the machine learning and the analytics to heart. that provides very interesting data. The impossible travel scenario that, within an hour's time, someone in North Carolina and Redmond and London and Russia all happen to be accessing the same place with the same account. Well, that's probably pretty unlikely. And so it'll highlight those kinds of scenarios as well as other anomalous patterns. Great capability there. Azure multi-factor authentication, that, hey, a certain set of conditions, whether it's the first time you log onto a device or you're logging on with a new IP in a different place that you haven't logged on before, we're going to go ahead and make sure that you can reach your phone before we let your account into things. Azure AD Privilege Identity Management is a powerful capability that you don't have standing privileges, and so you have privileges only on demand for your Azure tenant, and it forces you to proof up. So you have to have a multi-factor, whether it's a text message or an app or whatever, before you get your privileges to go beyond just that initial authentication. Azure Key Vault is a great asset to help with that key management of all the different things for either application developers or SQL and a number of other integration points. Azure RMS, a great way to encrypt your data in a way that embeds the policy with the encryption, so that the intent of who should or shouldn't have access to it is right there with the documents as it's being transmitted, regardless of whether it's on an iPhone, a Windows phone, a Windows PC. That policy and the encryption with it are all tied in together with the content. Office 365 has a great feature called Customer Lockbox that's going to be coming out at the end of 2015, early 2016, that essentially extends a key part of how we manage permissions internally. So privileges are only granted on demand in our data center. So if someone needs to have administrative access to your tenant, they don't have that standing privilege. They have to request access. It goes through a workflow, it goes through approval, it gets tracked. And with the Office 365 Customer Lockbox, they're actually extending that approval to you, the customer, so that if you opt into this program, you will have the approval of whether someone gets access to your tenant. In most cases, we don't need access to your tenant or your data. We don't really want it. It's not our business. But in the case you call in and you say, hey, I'm having a support issue, I need help with this, we can set it up so that your tenant will not let our admins in unless you approve it. And so it's a great way of extending some of the stuff that we're doing behind the scenes to include you in the approval process. There's a set of features around data loss prevention, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in the information protection. Conditional access, which allows you to set a set of different conditions before granting access to a SaaS application through Azure AD or various other resources. So there's a lot of capabilities and features in the platform, and we'll skim over a couple of them really quick here.
Yeah, so here's one from Azure Active Directory Premium. So Microsoft has a team called the Digital Crime Unit, which they do a whole bunch of things. So for instance, they try to protect vulnerable populations, for instance, like children from child exploitation. They also try to protect people from pirated software and all the malware that we know that's embedded in pirated software and so on. One of the things they've been doing over the last several years is taking down botnets that, botnets are used to attack legitimate customers. And so botnets are made up of thousands and thousands and thousands of compromised systems. And so what they've been doing is taking down botnets all over the world for several years. And many customers have asked us over time, hey, I'd really like that list of IP addresses to see if any of my IP addresses in those botnets are in my infrastructure, so that I know that whether there's botnets, compromised systems in my infrastructure that I'm currently not aware of.
I need to clean it up. Yeah.
Exactly. So what we started doing is putting that list of IP addresses into Azure. So if you're an Azure customer, an Azure Premium customer, and you go into Azure, there's a new report here, sign-ins from possibly infected devices. You can go to that report, and if IP addresses that are actually authenticating to your Azure infrastructure, Azure-based infrastructure, are part of those botnets, as you can see here on the slide, they'll actually show you what those IP addresses are and the botnet that they're part of. So this is gold dust to a lot of customers that have been asking us for those IP addresses for a long, long time. Another example of this is what's called leak credentials. So today, as you mentioned in Module 1 of this course, administrators are being targeted. People want admin credentials because if they can get admin credentials, they can move around environments once they're compromised, get access to information wherever it's stored, and so on. And so what we've been doing is going around to all these illicit forums and collecting lists of compromised credentials that are being sold and traded on these forums. And there's hundreds and hundreds of millions of leaked credentials out there for different systems around the world. And so we've been collecting those lists, and now we're putting them into Azure so that if credentials from your organization show up in those lists and are being traded on those illicit forums, you can now go to this Users with Leaked Credentials report inside of the Azure Active Directory Premium and see whether your credentials have actually been leaked. And what's really cool about this is, let's say, as you can see from this slide here, Susie, she had her credentials leaked. They were found someplace. Maybe they got stolen in a phishing attack or some type of attack like that. The administrator comes here, sees, oh, Susie's credentials have been leaked. The administrator can right-click on Susie's name or click on Susie's name here and just enforce multi-factor authentication. And now, even though her credentials have been leaked, someone has her password, unless they have the second factor, her smartphone, her landline number, that second factor, now whoever's trying to log in using those credentials, once they use the username and password, they're going to have the second factor in order to get into that account.
So if an attacker goes and they access one of these stolen databases that has a bunch of people's passwords, including Susie's, they can't get access to that account because they don't have Susie's phone.
And it's so easy to enable multi-factor authentication in Azure now. So that's what we're trying to do, is we're using real-world threat intel, putting it into our cloud services to allow you, the security professional, the CISO, and so on, the IT pro, to find out that this stuff is happening and then take action very, very quickly to prevent more data loss. All right, so here's one that maybe walk through the customer lockbox scenario.
Oh yeah, and this is the lockbox I was mentioning earlier. This is just what they call a wireframe, where they're mocking up the GUI to show how the feature will work. It may adjust a little bit before its final release, but it's showing you that, hey, you have a support case. You need to have access to, you've asked us to access your tenant through that support case, and so we need permission to it. And do you want to approve or reject that request? And so, Microsoft effectively doesn't have access to your tenant until you approve it. And it has all the information there to help enable that decision. And so that's just a way that we're extending that control and just reinforcing that this is not our data, it is your data, and you are in control of it.
All right, so here's one good resource for you. Many of the features that we just talked about, we actually currently have a cloud security control series running on our blog where we're writing in-depth articles on each one of these cloud security controls that we mentioned here. We've been writing about a bunch of them. I'll write a few more of these as well, because these are the questions customers are asking. Once we get past certifications and compliance and what are we doing across all of these services to be trustworthy, you want to know what security controls you have to mitigate the risks that you care about for your organization. And so between our blog, the blogs from Azure, they do awesome blogs, the Office 365 blogs, the Dynamics blogs, all of the security teams. We're creating a lot of content here because we're trying to be as transparent as possible and show you what we're doing and how we're trying to meet your expectations and your needs in order to gain your trust and get your business. That's what we're doing here. All right, so just to summarize, we're very, very committed to meeting and exceeding the expectations around security, privacy, and compliance for our customers. These things are challenging. As I say, often, security is not a destination, right? Security is a journey, because the attackers will never stop. They will not stop evolving their attacks. They will not stop trying to steal information. As we mentioned before, there's a lot of different motivations for this stuff. So we're not going to stop either. You have our commitment that we're going to continue to work to stay ahead of the attackers. We're watching the threat landscape. We're publishing a Microsoft Security Intelligence report that shows you a lot of the stuff that we see going on out there. We're introducing new features and functionality in Azure, Office 365, Dynamics, and so on constantly. We've got management capabilities in Intune and our Enterprise Mobility Suite that really are unrivaled today. So have a look at these things. There's lots of information out there, but we are committed to the cloud because it really is the center of mobile, big data, social networking. The cloud is Internet of Things. The cloud is the center of all of these things, and so we have to pay very, very close attention to the security, the privacy, the compliance of the cloud for our customers.
Absolutely. I mean, the cloud is the future of the technology and the capabilities that we're going to be seeing that are going to bring innovations and bring value to our personal lives, to our businesses, and we absolutely believe that we have to do everything we can to keep that secure and to help you with your part of keeping it secure. Absolutely 100% committed to that.
Great. Well, thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll see you in Module 3 of this course.
Thanks.